The scripture this morning is from Matthew 14, verses 22 through 34. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was so far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "Is it a ghost?" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me!" Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This ends the reading of the scripture.
So our lesson today begins with Jesus and the disciples in Bethsaida, where Jesus has just finished feeding thousands of people using 2 fish and about 5 loaves of bread. Now I would like you to take a moment and try to place yourself there, right there on the shore of Bethsaida with Jesus. Maybe you're one of the disciples who are there. Close your eyes if you need to, but really try to enter this story as if you were right there living it. There you are, along with the other disciples, busy picking up the leftover chunks of bread after around 20,000 people have eaten. And you wonder if all of these people who are gathered here, if they really understand what has just happened right in their midst, what you witnessed. Maybe you keep looking at some of the other disciples, catching their eye as if to say, "Do you believe this? Like 5 loaves and 2 fish? And we have leftovers?" You aren't really paying a whole lot of attention to anything else, but Jesus is. Jesus isn't quite as blown away as you are by his ability to feed all the hungry people. So Jesus is paying attention to other things, like the weather. Jesus notices that there are storm clouds forming in the distance. And so he calls all of you together, and he says, "I'm going to finish up here. I have a few more things to say to the people. I will dismiss them to go back to their homes. You all might want to get in the boat and get started on your way to Gennesaret before it gets dark. I believe there's a storm coming, but I can catch up with you tomorrow." So from Bethsaida on one side of the Sea of Galilee to Gennesaret on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, the destination is about a little over 7 miles. Now with the wind in your sails, that trip would take a little over an hour. With no wind in your sails, just rowing is going to take you about 2 hours to get from one place to the other. So you and the rest of the disciples, you quickly round up whatever things you may have and you get yourselves into that boat. No one likes to be caught on the Sea of Galilee in a storm. But just as you set out, the wind begins to come up. And immediately you know this trip is going to take a little bit longer because the wind is not in your sails. The wind is against you. It's going to take some hard rowing for you to get to the other side. And that wind keeps getting stronger and stronger. It begins to rain. And the sky darkens much faster than you would have thought it would. Lightning begins to flash. And now everyone is working a little harder. There's no talking now. No exclamations over the the miracle that you just saw on the banks of the Sea of Galilee by Bethsaida, everyone just kind of keeps glancing at the sky and rowing as hard as you can. But as hard as you and the others row, you're not getting far enough, fast enough. And then it gets worse. The rain starts to come down in sheets, and the thunder crashes, and you can see by the flashes of lightning that there is no land in sight. The fishermen on this boat, the fishermen among you are looking grim. They realize that the storm has blown the boat off course, way off course. And you are now closer to the middle of the lake, over its deepest part, the area commonly referred to as the abyss. No one really knows how deep this part of the lake is. No one has been able to go deep enough to find out. Even fishing on a calm day, the fishermen try to avoid this part of the lake. Everyone who spends time on the lake knows what is said about the deepest part of the Sea of Galilee, that at the bottom there may be a portal to the underworld. That is what is going through the disciples' minds. Are you still there? Are you still imagining yourself in that boat? It's pitch dark, except for the flashes of lightning. You've been rowing for hours now, literally, and you are exhausted. The rain has drenched everything, and the waves are splashing over the side of the boat, and you know that feeling when fear actually clenches your gut. And then suddenly, in this deep, terrifying part of the lake, in the flashes of lightning, you see something on the top of the waves. Before you can stop yourself, you cry out in fright, as does everyone else on the boat, which only makes it more terrifying because now you know you weren't just seeing things, everybody is seeing this. Your mind conjures up all kinds of terrifying possibilities. And first and foremost among them are that a ghost from the underworld has come to get you. The Bible tells us it was the fourth watch of the night, about 3 o'clock in the morning, when this happened. And Jesus sees the disciples struggling through the storm out in the middle of the lake. But you don't know that. You only know that there is something very frightening out there on the lake with you. And then above the screams, above the roar of the wind and the crashes of the thunder, you hear a familiar voice. And that voice says, "Be encouraged. It's me. Don't be afraid." The screams stop as all of you try to make out what is being said and who is saying it. And you strain to see what that is. And you wonder now if your eyes and your mind might be playing tricks on you. It couldn't be, could it? It really couldn't be. You saw him on the shore as you left. But then right beside you, you hear Simon. It's always Simon. You hear Simon saying, "Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water." And you think to yourself, "What?" You hear Jesus say, "Come." And all of a sudden, Simon, who should know better, is climbing over the side of the boat and out onto the deep of the water. Now, if you have been able to imagine yourself there, I have a question for you. What are you doing? Are you hanging on to the sides of the boat for dear life? Are you hiding? Are you pulling on Simon's ropes, trying to keep him in the boat? Do you drop your oar and get ready to follow him out of the boat? Or do you sit paralyzed with your heart in your throat? There are so many lessons in this story, lessons that Matthew knew we would all need to learn on our journey toward faithful discipleship. Because whether we ever get into a boat or not, we will all experience storms in our lives. Those storms might take the shape of an illness, of a relationship falling apart, of a loved one's death, of a job loss, of an addiction. None of us gets through life without traveling through some pretty major and frightening storms. Maybe you are going through such a storm right now. Maybe the water feels pretty deep and wild, and your boat seems to be blown every which way by the wind. And you are hanging on white-knuckled, longing with all of your being for a word or a sign of hope. I believe that Matthew includes this story to let us know that Jesus is capable of finding you, no matter how far any storm might blow you off course. He still walks on water. He is still willing and able to come and be with you and ride that storm out with you. None of us has to row through the storms that life sends our way all by ourselves. The storm might still be raging, but it is always a little less scary to know that Jesus is in the boat with you. So much of Christian spiritual life, so much of our worship and our prayer time and our reading of the Bible and hanging out with other Christians, so much of that is about our getting to know Jesus well enough that we can trust him when the storms hit. Lee and I will be in Ashland, Wisconsin tomorrow, attending the funeral of the only child of Lee's cousin, Ann. Aaron, who was 26 years old, was married on Saturday, September 1st of this year. And on Wednesday, September 5th, he was hit by a drunk driver and died at the scene of the accident, 4 days after his wedding. He's Ann's only son. He was her life. I cannot even begin to imagine the storm that is her life right now. The storm that she is having to walk through. But I am encouraged because Ann has spent enough time with Jesus that she will recognize him in the storm. His grace and his presence will not go unnoticed by her. I don't know Aaron's wife, Amber, but I pray that she too has spent that time and can recognize the grace of God when it shows itself in the midst of the storm. Of course, Simon, who often seems to speak before he thinks, adds some extra lessons for us in this story. Simon audaciously yells, "Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water. Order me out of the boat onto the water with you. Tell me to climb out of the boat over the deepest part of the sea in the midst of a wild storm." Why in the world would anyone say that? Does it make any sense? I read that and I think, wouldn't it have made more sense for Simon to say, "Jesus, if it's really you, come close enough for us to see you." Or, "Jesus, if it's really you, tell us how many loaves of bread it took to feed those 20,000 people." You know, or even, "Jesus, if it's really you, get in the boat with us." Those are the things that I would think to say. But Simon doesn't do that. Simon says, "If it's really you, Jesus, then order me out there with you." Kind of takes your breath away, doesn't it, if you can really put yourself out in that situation? This is what sets Simon apart from the rest of the disciples. This is what makes Simon kind of a rock star among the disciples. Simon is never halfway in. He is always all in. Now, he might be all wrong, as he sometimes is, but he is always all in. Simon, perhaps more than many of the disciples, he knows the trouble that they're in. He has spent enough time on the lake. His life has been spent on the lake. He knows the kind of storm that they're facing and how easily it would be for the boat to go down. But Simon believes that he sees Jesus in the midst of all of that trouble, and he wants to be where Jesus is. Maybe Simon knows at a gut level that the safest place to be in a storm is next to Jesus. John Ortberg has written a whole book on this Bible story called "If You Want to Walk on Water, You Have to Get Out of the Boat." And he makes the case in his book that we all have a boat. It's our comfort zone. It's what makes us feel safe. And most of us are too afraid to get very far out of our comfort zone. And so we miss some of the things that God is calling us to do and to see and to experience. The lure of feeling safe could actually be preventing us from experiencing the exhilaration of life with Jesus lived to the full. Now, thinking about Orbrick's point, I am reminded that not all of the storms that we encounter in this life are personal. Not all of them are things that are happening to us. I think of some of the problems that we have in this world that are so big that they can easily be likened to a life-threatening storm. As a Christian, I believe that God is at work in the midst of even the biggest, most complex problems and issues that we face. And oftentimes the only way to get on board with what God is doing, to join in what God is doing, is to ask Jesus to command us to get out of our boat and onto the waves. I think of Kennedy, one of the hydraulic engineers that works for World Vision that we visited when we went to Kenya. How much pressure must there be in knowing that 100,000 people are waiting for you to come up with an answer to provide them with clean water? These are people that have already had wells dug and the water was bad underneath. So they need another solution. And Kennedy has chosen to give his life to World Vision to work to find those kinds of solutions. Since I've been to Kenya this fall, I keep thinking to myself, soon those mothers that we talked with will be making those dangerous all-night-long trips to find water for their family. And I can't even imagine. But I think about that and I pray for them, and then I think, I wonder what it's like for the World Vision staff to know that October is coming, the dry season is coming, and once again, they're going to be walking for hours and hours to find water. How much pressure must there be? Surely there were more comfortable jobs for an engineer in Kenya. But Kennedy chose to get out of the boat and be where he saw Jesus at work. I understand, I think a little more, why nothing comes before devotions and worship for the World Vision staff there. They have to remember always that they have the hand of Jesus with them as they do this work. I think of grandmothers who probably never ever saw themselves ending up on the wrong side of the law, but who could not silently stand by as children were separated from their parents at the border this summer. I remember watching the news one day as a grandmother was arrested for trespassing as she brought toys to one of the detention centers. Others have opened their homes to asylum seekers so that they have a place to stay. They have an actual address as their case makes its way through the courts. I see all of these as people who saw the storm, who understood the risks, but they also saw Jesus. And they realized that joining Jesus was more important than their comfort zone. I think of the white hats in Syria who go in when the bombs fall. I think of the Cajun Navy that is at work even now in North Carolina. Those people who bring their boats and go out in the midst of a hurricane to rescue people who are stranded. These are all people who stretch themselves, who are willing to go out in the storm to do the work that Jesus is doing by his side. I could name many more, but we have to get to the rest of this story. Simon climbs out of the boat and he experiences what it is like to walk on water. I want to say that again. Simon gets out of the boat and he experiences what it is like to walk on water. How amazing is that? As far as I know, Simon is the only person ever recorded to literally walk on water. I do believe there are a lot of people, though, who have experienced some of that kind of exhilaration. The experience of doing something utterly amazing because they dared to leave their comfort or their safety zone, and they got involved in something that really couldn't be done without the power of Christ beside them. So Simon is walking on the water. Like, how cool is that? And then the wind comes up. And Simon turns to look at the wind, and he sees the waves rolling about his feet. And what happens? Fear takes over. He begins to sink. And he turns back to Jesus and cries, "Lord, rescue me!" And Jesus immediately reaches out his hand and pulls Simon up to safety. Now, Matthew tells us that Jesus says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And it might seem like Jesus is being a little harsh there with Simon. But we can't really hear the inflection in the writing, can we? I wonder if Jesus was saying, "Oh, Peter, why did you look away? I had you. I have you." I don't think Jesus was chastising Peter. After all, Peter was the only one that had the courage to actually get out of the boat. Sometimes when we are willing to step out of our comfort zones, when we want to be a part of what Jesus is doing in the world, we can easily take our eyes off of Jesus and focus on the problem and become overwhelmed. Think of what it took for Martin Luther King Jr. to do what he did, to continue to speak truth to power, to march for civil rights, knowing that people could and would get hurt as a result of that, to live with constant death threats. Some of Martin Luther King Jr.'s closest friends have said that when he would get scared and when he would get discouraged, he would often sing that old gospel hymn, "Precious Lord, take my hand." That was his way, I believe, of refocusing his eyes on Jesus rather than on the dangers and the risks and the problems. No matter how big the storm or how far out of the boat we find ourselves, if we keep our eyes on Jesus, we will know that he has us. That he has us. So Jesus and Peter get into the boat. With a word, Jesus quiets the storm, and the disciples all fall on their knees and worship him right there, saying, "You must be God's Son." Now, there are a couple of things that you might not be aware of that lead them to that statement. First, when Jesus comes to them over the water, our Bibles tell us that he says, "Be encouraged, it's me. Don't be afraid." But that's not actually exactly what Jesus said. What Jesus said was, "Be encouraged, I am. Don't be afraid." Do y'all remember "I am"? Do you remember Moses in the Old Testament by the burning bush? And God is calling Moses to go and to rescue, to lead God's people out of slavery. And Moses says, "But who should I tell him sent me? Like, what God are you?" And God answers, "I am." That is God's personal name, I am. And when Jesus speaks to the disciples over the storm, he says, "Be encouraged, I am. Don't be afraid." That's one big clue right there. But there are also a few Hebrew scriptures that would probably have been very near and dear to anybody who spent much time on the water. Psalm 89:9 says, "You, O God, rule over the surging sea. When its waves rise up, it's you who makes them still." Psalm 107 talks of many instances of God intervening to save God's people. And in verses 23 through 32, it tells of those who had gone out to make their living on the high seas. And the storm came up, and the waves rose as high as the sky, and the sailors' courage melted. And it says they cried out in distress, and God quieted the storm to a whisper. The sea's waves were hushed. And Job writes, God is the one who treads the waves of the sea. God walks on water. Those would have been the scriptures that our disciples were familiar with. So it is no wonder when Jesus gets in the boat, after walking to them on water, after quieting the storm, that they would say, "You must be God's Son." God is the one who calms the waves, who stills the storm, who walks on water. And so the disciples understood, and Peter shows us, that when we look at Jesus, we see God. That is the final lesson in this story. When we look at Jesus, we see God. We see that the Christian faith calls us to step outside of our boats and that when we say yes, when being with Jesus is more important than being comfortable or safe, life holds the possibility of becoming truly awesome. And we are assured that in the midst of even the worst of storms, Christ walks with us. Jesus still walks on water. He will still get in your boat. He will sail those stormy seas with you. Would you please pray with me? Mighty God, how grateful we are for this story. In the midst of wind and waves, we see you, Jesus, walking on water. Thank you for what this story teaches us about having you in our lives. Thank you for what it teaches us about how to live faithfully as your disciples. Please be present in our boats, Jesus, no matter what the weather may do. For those of us who have a hard time stepping out of our safety zone, who can't imagine climbing out of the boat, who live with no as our default answer, help us be brave enough to say yes. Help us see you and instill in us a desire to be with you where you are, even if it feels a little scary or a little crazy. Help us keep our eyes on you and know that you will keep us safe. Lord, help all of us together be the disciples you want us to be. We love and praise you in your holy name.